Good morning. Welcome to Taxpayers for Common Sense's webinar, Hidden Drivers of Pentagon Spending. I'm Steve Ellis, president of Taxpayers for Common Sense, a national nonpartisan budget watchdog that for 30 years has worked across the budget for a more fiscally responsible government. And that certainly includes tackling bloat at the Pentagon. We have a great panel for you today. I'll introduce them briefly and turn it over to our moderator, John Donnelly. There will be an opportunity for audience questions at the end. Please submit them through the chat, and the moderator will pose them to the panel. As I mentioned, our moderator is John Donnelly, senior defense writer at CQ Roll Call, where he focuses on defense issues. He has won numerous awards for his outstanding journalism, including the National Press Foundation's Dirksen Award for the most outstanding reporting on Congress and the National Press Club's Dornheim Award for the best coverage of defense issues. Gabe Murphy is a policy analyst at Taxpayers for Common Sense, where he focuses on national security. His work includes tracking the Pentagon budget as it moves through Congress, highlighting wasteful programs, and exposing spending practices that drive the Pentagon budget ever upwards. He spent more than a decade working in the nonprofit sector on national security and foreign policy issues and holds an MA in Global Studies for the University of California, Berkeley. Julia Gledhill is a research analyst for the National Security Reform Program at the Stimson Center. She focuses her research and writing on Pentagon spending, military contracting, and weapons acquisition. Prior to joining Stimson, Julia was an analyst at the Center for Defense Information at the Project on Government Oversight and a program associate for the Militarism and Human Rights Program at the Friends Committee on National Legislation. Julia co-hosts the Undiplomatic podcast, and she is a frequent commentator on both the press and the news media. Pete Sepp is president of National Taxpayers Union. He leads the nonprofit, nonpartisan NTU's government affairs, public relations, and development activities. Pete also oversees strategic planning for NTU and its staff and supervises the research and educational operations of the National Taxpayers Union Foundation. Since beginning his service with NTU in 1988, Pete has written and edited numerous policy papers, informational publications, and activist manuals, as well as studies on topics such as congressional prerequisites, citizen-initiated tax revolts, antitrust and competition regulation, and Pentagon spending. Thank you all very much for being here. John, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Steve, and appreciate your inviting me to participate today. We are at a really interesting time to hold our conversation about the defense budget. Less than 48 hours ago, the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, for fiscal year 2026 was filed, unveiled, and the House expects to vote on it this week, with the Senate expected to file suit by the end of the year. And meanwhile, appropriations are still out there. Starting with authorization, there's $901 billion approximately endorsed by this NDAA, as they call it, for fiscal 2026, compared to about $895 billion in fiscal year 2025. So a very, very modest increase, but there's a big however, and that is the reconciliation legislation that was enacted in July, which contains about $156 billion for defense. So that's authorization on the NDAA. Reconciliation is appropriations. Appropriations for fiscal 2026 are still TBD. The House has passed its bill for defense, which and the Senate has not. And right now, the entire government, almost the entire government, is operating on a continuing resolution, a stopgap measure that runs out on July 30th. So that's the next deadline ahead for fiscal 2026 spending. And it's not clear exactly how they're going to reach agreement on defense, what it might be packaged with, or whether they'll meet that deadline or have to have one or more additional continuing resolutions. Remember, in fiscal 2025, the Pentagon did, for the entire fiscal year on a continuing resolution. So the defense appropriations in the Senate is $22 billion higher than it is in the House. So that's a big gap that has to be reconciled. The defense authorization, jumping back to that, is an $8 billion increase over the amount requested by the president and also the amount approved by the House side. But it's not the $32 billion increase that the Senate Armed Services Committee had wanted. So long story short, in the authorization bill, the Hawks got a portion of what they wanted, but not nearly what they wanted. So we'll see what happens on the appropriation side. Meanwhile, fiscal 2027 is right around the corner. The defense budget's being finalized as we speak in the Pentagon and in the White House. And sometime early next year, it's supposed to happen in February, we'll be seeing yet another budget request. So that's sort of where we stand on the authorization and appropriation stuff right now. So I'm looking, and there's a lot of other big pieces in motion. The national security strategy just came out that is supposed to focus attention more on the Western Hemisphere. You've got a Golden Dome missile defense project that is apparently in the developmental stages, but we haven't heard a lot of details on that. You've got a nuclear modernization that's costing on average annual cost of about $100 billion a year. So there's a lot happening. Now, today we're going to hear three separate but somewhat related topics. We're going to start with Gabe Murphy to tell us about one of the biggest drivers of defense budgets, which is what are called program increases, or as I think Gabe would have it, de facto earmarks in the defense appropriations process. And then Julia Gledhill is going to talk to us about emerging plans for acquisition reform. And then Pete Snepp is going to discuss the reconciliation process and how that fits in this picture. So why don't we just throw it over to you, Gabe, and let you tell us a little bit about the program increases piece of this.
Thanks very much, John. It's great to be here with you and our other panelists to try and shine some light on these largely hidden spending practices. And congressional increases to the Pentagon budget, these program increases, or de facto earmarks, as I like to call them, are a big one. In the funding tables of the House and Senate's draft Pentagon spending bill for this year, formerly called the Defense Appropriations Act, lawmakers proposed over $52 billion worth of so-called program increases for procurement and research projects alone. That's the cumulative cost of over 1,400 individual increases in the House and Senate bills. It's more than double the cost of those proposed increases just 2 years ago. You can take a look at these increases in our database, which catalogs each of them in a sortable, searchable format at taxpayer.net under Our Work and Databases. Now, when the House and Senate reconcile the differences between their two versions of these spending bills, the final numbers will look a little different. Sometimes they propose increases for the same project, in which case they often just take the larger of the two numbers, if not combine them. Where they land on the top line can also impact which increases make the cut, but by and large, Congress tends to keep the majority of these increases from each bill. And their costs really add up quickly. Over 90% of the individual increases in the past 2 years were for under $50 million. But as our esteemed moderator, John Donnelly, reported over the summer, in the past 3 years, increases in the final spending bills cost taxpayers well over $100 billion. Lawmakers call these program increases, but in practice, they can operate as backdoor earmarks in the Pentagon budget, allowing lawmakers to funnel money to their states, districts, campaign contributors, and sometimes even companies they hold stock in. Unlike formal earmarks, these program increases are largely anonymous, with most of them originating in the appropriations committees. When these bills make it to the floor, which they often do in the House, rarely do in the Senate before they're conferenced, sponsors are identified, but these amendments generally pass by voice vote en bloc in a package of amendments. So there's virtually no debate over them. Another difference is that earmarks require lawmakers to certify that they have no financial interest in the earmark and to identify the recipients. In contrast, there's no financial interest certification for program increases and no requirement to identify recipients because the funding is supposed to be competitively awarded, or at least rewarded to projects that have received competitive awards in the past. The problem with that, though, is that many of these increases are written so specifically that only one company is well positioned to receive an award for it. Combine that with the anonymity that this process offers lawmakers, and it's easy to see the potential for abuse. And we've identified a long list of questionable increases in recent years where lawmakers have effectively earmarked funds for their campaign contributors through this process. The only reason we know who's responsible for some of these increases is that some lawmakers take credit for them in press releases. In the bills currently making their way through Congress, for example, Appropriations Chair Susan Collins, a Republican of Maine, took credit for a $282 million increase for F-35 engine upgrades managed by Pratt & Whitney, which is a subsidiary of RTX. Now, according to Open Secrets, a nonpartisan organization that tracks money in politics, PACs and individuals tied to RTX contributed over $65,000 to Senator Collins' campaign committee and leadership PAC from 2019 to 2024. And her husband also reportedly owns $50,000 worth of RTX stock. This kind of thing happens on both sides of the aisle. It's a fully bipartisan phenomenon. Democratic Senators Dick Durbin and Tammy Duckworth of Illinois issued a joint press release taking credit for an $88 million increase for the shop equipment contact maintenance vehicle, basically a maintenance Humvee. These were manufactured by AM General. And from 2019 to 2024, PACs and individuals tied to that company contributed over $32,000 to Senator Durbin's campaign. And those tied to AM General's parent company, KPS Capital Partners, gave over $42,000 to Senator Duckworth's campaign committee and leadership PAC. On top of these potential conflicts of interest, these increases are often offset with funding cuts elsewhere in the Pentagon budget. There's no transparency about the offsets for increases originating in committee. For those proposed on the floor, lawmakers list offsets, but they're often at the account level. So that really, I think, underscores that lawmakers are not really grappling with all of the trade-offs associated with these increases. The House-passed bill, for instance, includes over $33 billion in increases for procurement and research projects, but it cuts over $12 billion from operation and maintenance accounts to help pay for them. That's a problem because the Pentagon has a $271 billion backlog of deferred maintenance and repairs at its facilities. That's up from $137 billion in 2020. And this has a real impact on service member safety and quality of life and readiness. It's part of why we have military personnel living in broken down barracks with black mold. It's part of the reason, these maintenance needs are chronically underfunded is because Congress routinely pillages operations and maintenance accounts to pay for these weapons programs that benefit their states, districts, and campaign contributors. So, looking at the big picture here, it's indisputably Congress's prerogative to make cuts and increases to the Pentagon budget request as it works through the budget process. But if lawmakers think it's a good idea to add tens of billions of dollars every year to the Pentagon budget, whether that's at the expense of other programs or a higher top line, they should be willing to put their name on it and explain why their proposals are a net positive for national security. With the exception of classified programs, which are a small percentage of the increases, there's no reason any of this needs to happen in the shadows.
Well, thanks, Gabe, for that overview of the issue. And I've written, as you pointed out, several stories on this with great help from Taxpayers for Common Sense using your databases in recent years. So I'm very familiar with it. But you pointed out there that the obvious fact that Congress has a duty to add and subtract from the budget. That's what they're there for. They're not there to rubber stamp things. But the trouble here is how do this is sort of happening, in the shadows. This phenomenon, which is one of the biggest drivers of federal spending, if you think about it, $100 billion in the last several years, has not really gotten much attention. So do you think transparency is gonna help? And is this going to be like a name and shame thing, or how do you think transparency is going to help? And are there any other ways that you can think of to sort of get at this problem?
Yeah, thanks, John. I think transparency is key. Otherwise we can't tell who's proposing these increases and, look at the potential conflicts of interest. To your question on naming and shaming, I think, look, there are certainly, I would hope that there are some, genuine efforts in here to strengthen national security. I mean, there's 1,400 program increases, so there better be. But, I think that a while back, Congress implemented transparency measures around formal earmarks, just, for the purpose of reducing these conflicts of interest. And, I think it wasn't until there was some naming and shaming around earmarks that happened. And so, I'm not necessarily saying that the increases I just highlighted are were done for anything other than national security, but looking at the process as a whole, I do think we need to question that, and Congress needs to be considering, what are the trade-offs here, and transparency would go a long way towards jumpstarting that conversation and making this more of a debate.
Yeah, also, a key element here is, as you pointed out, unlike formal earmarks, these are at least officially competed, right? But if the program is the thin layer attenuator, radioactive decombobulator, or whatever, so some of the names of these projects are just insanely specific. There's a good chance that there's only one company that makes it, right? And these press releases touting the awards, indicate that, yeah, this is going to be made in Montana, even though it's strictly competed. So one thing that I have been surprised about is that, here's two questions we don't know. Well, there's several, but here's two of them. Number one, how many of these officially competed awards actually attract more than one bidder? That would be an interesting thing to find out. And then the second is, what percentage of these ads over the years have actually yielded operational systems for the U.S. military? And to me, those are a couple of really good questions that maybe the Government Accountability Office or the Inspector General Office maybe would be well served to look into. But it's no one's asked them to do that, right?
Yeah, to my knowledge, no one's asked. There was a requirement a couple years back in the NDAA that required the Pentagon to report on these increases when they were over $20 million. But yeah, I think, largely speaking, there's not a lot of reporting on the results of these increases, and that's part of the problem. So I think that needs to happen too.
Yeah, and those reports are, I may be the only person who's ever writes about those reports. They're buried on the comptroller site. Nobody in Congress, as far as I know, including the sponsors of the amendment that call for the report, Senator Alyssa Slotkin is one of them. I think she's maybe the only one who actually wrote an amendment requiring that report. I haven't seen her even comment at all on the output. So it kind of disappears into the woodwork. Okay, so let's transition here, I think, to the subject of acquisition. I hate to use the word reform because it kind of implicitly sends a message of endorsement of the proposal. We prefer to use the term overhaul because it's not necessarily a good idea what's being proposed, although I'm sure there's a lot of goodness in what is being proposed. And what we're talking about are the Defense Department. Pete Hegseth has put forward a set of proposals to change acquisition. The House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee wrote their separate approaches to the subject, and they just came out hours ago with the melded version of their two proposals in the NDAA. And I don't envy you, Julia, because this is a very complicated subject with a lot of moving pieces. So can you help us understand sort of what the NDAA produced and maybe how it compares to the Pentagon get us started on understanding this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, John. And appreciate Gabe for setting the stage here in terms of the political dynamics in Congress, because they are absolutely a critical factor in the burgeoning and strengthening acquisition reform movement. And I completely agree, John. I am guilty of using acquisition reformers language because it does imply that it is a positive change to the law and contracting regulation. I don't share that view. And I've also made the mistake of characterizing their policy proposals as deregulation when in fact it's not a third party deregulating a transaction between a purchaser and a seller. The Pentagon, the government, is in fact the purchaser. And so in a lot of ways, in my view, acquisition overhaulers are actually shooting themselves in the foot in the Pentagon's own ability to negotiate deals with arms manufacturers. So to zoom out for a moment, acquisition overhaul is an effort to drastically change the way that the Pentagon buys weapons. It is driven by a desire primarily to militarily compete with China by attempting to produce far more weapons at a much faster pace. Now, proponents of this acquisition overhaul boldly suggest that the main problem with weapons acquisition is that the system itself is too slow to accommodate the military's needs and to keep up with the pace of innovation and technological development. As a result, they propose that the Pentagon essentially eradicate what are standard purchasing practices that provide the Pentagon with the tools to hold contractors accountable, particularly on cost, but also on things like transparency and performance. And so when I say, standard purchasing practices, I'm really talking about the oversight and accountability mechanisms that the Pentagon has. And these are tools that allow the Pentagon to make sure that they aren't getting price gouged a lot of the time. So an example would be certified cost and pricing data. I'm wary of going too deep into the weeds on contracting policy here, but essentially what you need to know is that, a lot of times there is one seller for a particular piece of military equipment or a weapon system or a spare part, as you duly noted. And, the Pentagon doesn't have the market to ensure that prices are competitive. And so they need certain cost and pricing information from contractors to ensure that, those sole source contractors in particular are not totally bilking the government, are not overcharging taxpayers on military equipment far beyond what is legally known as the fair and reasonable price. This is not to say that they're not allowed to profit. Of course, they're allowed to profit. They are companies. But when we say fair and reasonable price, we're talking about, an acceptable profit margin, which this is debatable, sure. Some people say between 6 and 7%, whereas you'll see defense contractors often in double that range for particular weapon systems or spare parts. And so acquisition overhaulers make the argument that actually we don't need cost and pricing requirements, for example, because it slows the process down, and that's actually impeding our ability to do competition. Now, we can have an entirely different webinar about the merits and drawbacks of framing our foreign and defense policy through the lens of strategic competition. But that conversation aside, the claim that the main issue with our acquisition process is in fact bureaucracy is actually a really bold one. And it's one that acquisition overhaulers have made for decades. And the reason for that is because of the incentives at play, right? They are able to glean more and more from the government financially when they see this type of easing of contracting laws and regulations. Now, cost and pricing data isn't the only one that I'm talking about. I'm also talking about accounting practices, for example. How does a contractor allocate costs on a contract to then invoice the government? Those are pretty standard accounting practices that without them, they're called cost accounting standards. Without them, a contractor might be able to bill the government for operating costs that have nothing to do with a government contract. And that is another proposal that's integrated into this acquisition overhaul that we've seen overhaulers push for all year, and that is now integrated into the NDAA. Another one is exempting non-traditional military contractors, namely Silicon Valley tech firms, from cost and pricing data requirements because they're considered commercial. Of course, commercial is another sort of battleground for acquisition overhaulers in that they want everything to be commercial, regardless of whether it has actually been sold to the public. And so there's a lot of sort of wonky, specific definitional issues at play in the federal acquisition regulation and in the law. And I'll close my comments just by saying that, Congress, to Gabe's point about incentives, whether they be, financial incentives or political ones, are really skewed in the direction of prioritizing profit over production and national security, right? Military contractors face no consequences for going over budget and falling behind schedule on our acquisition programs. And the culprit in their eyes is always going to be the system that inhibits them from garnering more profits. But, acquisition overhaulers also have a point. We do have a production problem in the United States. I would posit that is because we can't decide what it is that the military actually needs and why. And instead, we keep trying to square a circle that's just not going to fit. We have to reckon with overreach, strategic overreach, and the acquisition implications of that, because we do have constraints as a country, not just financially, but also logistically in terms of capacity, in terms of workforce. And so we can have much more productive conversations about what state capacity we need to produce what munitions and why. But what we're seeing from acquisition overhaulers is essentially gut the process, and let's assume that spending more money and lifting oversight guardrails is going to improve acquisition outcomes. And that is simply not what we have seen over the course of the past 30 plus years of Congress, again, pushing these types of reforms. Now, what we've seen in 2025 is an incredibly heightened, exaggerated version of these reforms that has really taken it further than we've seen since really the Clinton administration in the 90s. But I want to emphasize that this is not new. It is a decades-long project to, secure windfall profits for military contractors.
Yeah, it is an exceedingly complicated subject, and you're right. It would take, I would think, multiple webinars to really break it all down. But I'm sure there are ways in which the system has gotten clogged up with well-meaning. The point behind the laws and the regulations is to make sure we get it not just fast but right, and in other words, that it works. Safely and effectively can perform the mission. But I'm reminded of so many GAO audits that have found kind of the opposite of what the acquisition overhaul people are arguing, which is, they're saying we need to go faster and build things faster, which obviously we do. Especially if you look, for example, at the rates of drone production in Ukraine, of inexpensive drones versus how long and how expensively it takes the United States to do it. But what GAO has found is that the major boondoggles that we have seen over the years has been because they've gone too fast. They have gone into programs before the technologies are mature. They have started to procure systems before the development is complete, so-called concurrency. So so a lot of the evidence is actually in favor of being more careful and maybe even a little, if not slower. Careful doesn't necessarily mean slower, but sometimes it does, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, this is why we have rapid acquisition pathways, is to prototype emerging technologies for which there is a capability gap in a very short period of time.
Another issue in the NDAA is this intellectual property issue, so-called right to repair. I don't know if you followed that at all. This is the idea of how the services sometimes are either unable to access data or unable to access it at a reasonable cost when they need to repair and sustain a weapons system, because the contractors control the data rights. And there's been an effort to give the government, not just in the Congress, but also in the Pentagon, to give the government more control over the data rights from the outset of a program, so that the contractors don't have so much say over the availability and the cost of those parts. That's also been an issue, right?
Yes, this has been a huge issue. Gabe has also worked on this issue. I mean, operations and maintenance is the biggest part of the defense budget. I want to say it's like 40%. And the reason why is often because we do see concurrent development wherein the military is designing and building a system at the same time simultaneously. And that turns out doesn't work very well. It means that you do discover design flaws, what the DoD would characterize as defects. And then you spend a whole lot of money trying to fix them. It's like building a shitty house and then constantly renovating it. I mean, it's the most expensive, least strategic way to build anything. And to a greater point, we could talk about the specifics of the acquisition process, about how we buy things versus how we decide what to buy. But, I think the bigger question for the DoD at this point is, how are we going to discern what technologies we need long term? Because it's only going to get harder to make those decisions. It is 2025. Artificial intelligence, emerging technologies are developing at an incredibly fast rate. And so there's only going to be more technologies for the DoD to decide between. And I think that that's going to make our decision process even more difficult. And so we need to start thinking about, like, how is it that we're actually going to distinguish between what is going to stand the test of time? Because, again, we need to exercise that muscle now if we ever intend to use it.
One other NDAA issue I wanted to make sure that I asked you about, Julia, is, and I think you were the one who dug this up, by the way. Apparently there's a provision in there that would allow contractors to get reimbursed for the interest costs that they pay. Tell us about that.
Sure. Yeah. So I kind of casually tweeted this yesterday. I really didn't expect people to respond to it. But I saw something in the NDAA, Section 803, that would change the way that the government views allowability. Allowability in terms of acquisition means, can the government reimburse you for that cost? Is it a reimbursable expense on a government contract? And for over 85 years, literally, since the 30s, the government has refused to pay contractors for their borrowing costs. Why? Because it's an integral part of doing business. It's a cost of doing business, right? You need to have capital and you need to pay for it. This amendment is an incredibly consequential change in the way that we do military contracting. Now, I will caveat it by saying, of course, we still need votes on NDAA, and appropriators have to appropriate money for this purpose. So the NDAA, this policy change is a huge deal, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the government is guaranteeing we're going to cover all your interest payments. That would be a crazy financial risk to assume. I noted on Twitter, Lockheed Martin last year paid almost $18 billion in interest. So think about that times 5, times 10, the primes, that is essentially, it could turn into like $1 trillion write-off. It would basically say borrowing is free. So why would a contractor ever use their own capital to invest in their business? And this is an issue. It has been an issue for a long time that military contractors refuse to spend money on, capital investments or independent R&D. And instead, they tend to enrich their shareholders. And, that's part of how we've ended up with the capacity constraints that we do have, because, Congress doesn't institute any kind of consequences to military contractors that wouldn't exist without government contracts for, again, not investing in their businesses, and instead coming to Congress and crying poor and saying we need more and more to revitalize the defense industrial base. So, I truly hope that this provision is, nixed from the final NDAA. I think people are really concerned about it from what I've heard on the Hill. I'm not sure where it came from, but it is a massive change in government policy to say borrowing is free. I mean, imagine how much Lockheed's interest payments would be if this provision was included in the final bill. It would be double. They can take all the capital they want, and the government, is likely to cover a good portion of that if this were passed in the final bill. So it is just, I was absolutely scandalized to read.
Well, thanks for that. And thanks for that explanation. And I don't think it's going to be changed. I think what's in there now is what is going to be voted on. So if there may be an opportunity there's always an opportunity to revisit anything that's in law, in subsequent Congresses. So, all right. So speaking of laws, how about that reconciliation? July 4th, it's an easy date to remember. That's when it was enacted. $156 billion for the Defense Department alone. And oh, by the way, I'm calling it reconciliation, but some people refer to it as the one big, beautiful bill. But like acquisition reform, I prefer to call it reconciliation. It's a little bit more of a neutral term. But Pete Stepp, tell us a little bit about, what's going on, what is in that reconciliation bill and about the process, especially the oversight elements here.
Well, sure. I just want to pick up very quickly on one of Julia's comments, the discussion you were having over these interest costs. One Big Beautiful Bill Act made permanent an interest write-off at the corporate level for tax purposes, certain interest, not all interest. So that's already being handled through OBA. Plus, I would argue that if contractors want their interest costs paid for, here's a trade. The Pentagon has to factor in debt interest costs for every single project they want financed by taxpayers. I don't think they're going to request that anytime soon or buy into that bargain. But with reconciliation, I don't want to get too far into the basic details of the process, but more of the history of the process to explain why we shouldn't be surprised that Pentagon spending is now being moved through the vehicle of reconciliation. When you look at the fact that reconciliation was set up over 50 years ago through the Budget Act of 1974 to kind of speed up the process of setting revenue, spending, and debt targets through House and Senate action guided by a resolution that instructs committees and an actual reconciliation bill that reflects the instructions to get past the filibuster, you understand that it was always an attractive thing for those who wanted to push through big increases in federal spending across the board. What was stopping it? Well, for one thing, a realization as an institution that reconciliation was really conceived to try and control federal deficits, either through tax increases or spending reductions. And that's the way it worked for a large part of its early history. When I began work at NTU in 1988, the OBRA, not OBA, OBRA, at that time, the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act was focused on deficit reduction. There had been several before 1988, several after 1988. Structural changes such as welfare reform, those kinds of things were done through reconciliation. What changed was around 2001 when tax relief bills such as with acronyms like EGTRA and JEGTRA, TIPRA, over a 15-year period began to be passed through reconciliation without as much attention to their deficit impacts. Now, for progressives, you're going to hate me when I say this, it's also been used to push through left-wing priorities such as Affordable Care Act, such as Inflation Reduction Act. Nominally, some of those were said to have reduced the deficit, didn't turn out that way, nowhere close. And all through this process, the various guardrails that were established for reconciliation have been gradually stripped away. One provision that had the so-called Byrd Rule, which prevented extraneous policies from being attached to reconciliation bills, was you couldn't do anything to Social Security. Well, I counted this morning before I came on to this webinar, at least 6 out of 24 reconciliation bills that have been signed into law over the past 50 years that did indeed affect Social Security. There's also a prohibition against appropriations being made through the reconciliation process. Well, the clever tactic there is to simply put a big sum of money out there in reconciliation with minimal instructions. Play that game so that you get money that functions like appropriations with even less oversight and guidance from Congress. Case in point there was the Inflation Reduction Act provisions giving $80 billion of additional funding to the Internal Revenue Service using 3 paragraphs of language in IRA, basically saying to the service, here's $80 billion, devote more than half of it to something called enforcement, devote a tiny portion to something called taxpayer services, another to modernization, the rest to support. They threw this money over the transom at the IRS and basically said, go hunting. I can tell you from the work that I've done on IRS reform and restructuring for the better part of 40 years, what subsequently happened with that money was that the IRS took its budget and appropriation requests from the past 10 years off the shelf and operationalized those. That money functioned just like appropriations. So when you think of all of that past history, it's not terribly surprising to see why we got in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, $156.8 billion of new military spending. Again, my organization supported the tax relief and SNAP and Medicare reforms contained in OBA. We don't support this, a massive sop to Pentagon spending, because it is opening up another sad chapter in a history of reconciliation abuse. I just want to give credit to my colleague Julia here for an excellent paper, an overview on the $156 billion in OBA, a really handy chart that begins on page 2 of the paper, which instructs everyone in the way this really sinister spending increase was pushed through. When you take a look at the purposes of the money being spent, you can see how they're playing this game of essentially hiding appropriation priorities on reconciliation by providing just enough detail to sneak under the Byrd rules and other restrictions with reconciliation, while still funding a bunch of priorities that the Pentagon has claimed are priorities for a number of years, but really aren't. Here you've got something on the order of $15 billion for nuclear force modernization. I call that an equivalent of an entitlement in a civilian program, this thinking that we have to have a triad forever, and no one can challenge the notion. 9% of that $156.8 billion goes toward nuclear modernization, including, very comically, something called risk reduction for the Sentinel ballistic missile program. I can make a prediction right now. You're not going to reduce the risk of the program to taxpayers by funding it further. The biggest insult here, they have a set aside not only for additional Inspector General funding, but also upgrades to technology for audits of the Pentagon, which they haven't yet been able to actually pass. That funding combined amounts to 0.3% of the entire amount given in OBA. That is a slap in the face to taxpayers. It absolutely guarantees that the rest of this money will not be properly overseen. That's the supreme irony here. There is a barely functioning authorization and appropriation process for Pentagon spending that exists right now. You can't say that really for most of the rest of the federal government, totally dysfunctional authorization and appropriation processes. Here we have a minimally functional one that's already being eroded with an additional amount being added to the top line in NDAA, but it's there. It should be used for the purpose of oversight and prioritization. This OBA lump sum gets around even those minimal safeguards. It's going to incentivize this practice year after year, just as it has with domestic spending. And the lack of detail here, again, very underhanded. That's the only word I can really say about it. Just enough to get under the wire, but cleverly disguised so that we don't get the kind of oversight we need. And, oh, wait, with 0.3% of this funding going to actual oversight, again, we are not going to do right by taxpayers. So if anyone on this webinar calls themselves a fiscal conservative, it's important to remember that every single mistake being made on the domestic spending side of the ledger is being repeated here on the Pentagon spending side of the ledger. And by some measurements, it's happening even more egregiously. So that's why we need to be concerned about what's going on here. History of the reconciliation process is not on our side, not on the taxpayer's side.
Well, thanks for that overview of it. Yeah, so essentially, it's the lack of detail, right? That makes it the lack of detail that makes it difficult for anyone to understand what these large sums of money are for. If I'm hearing you correctly, and one that has jumped out at me is no less than $25 billion in the reconciliation bill for the Golden Dome project, right? And there's very little detail about what, at least in the legislation, of what exactly that's going to go toward. And the reality is that the Pentagon doesn't really know yet, or if they know, they haven't actually shared it with anyone. And how do I know that? Well, I was wondering because, Democrats say we haven't gotten enough information, and Republicans say, oh, we've gotten just enough information about this. But the NDAA that came out less than 48 hours ago called for a plan from the Pentagon for its Golden Dome system, including what are the, quote, capabilities of the system. So if less than 48 hours ago they said we don't know what this thing is, and yet in July they appropriated $25 billion for it, is that not a good example of a lack of detail being a problem?
Well, yeah, there are a lot of contradictions here. If you look at shipbuilding, for example, that's included in reconciliation, they make clear what they want to do with it, buying more submarines, guided missile destroyers, and the like. On the other hand, and I'm referring again to Julia's great chart here, there's $16 billion for expansion of, quote, programs to accelerate the procurement and fielding of innovative technologies, unquote. Okay, what's an innovative technology? What's the program? Who's going to run it? Who's going to oversee it? Is this subject to relaxed contracting procedures or conventional ones? No detail on that. It probably exists somewhere. They don't want to show their cards because then people like all of us would get on their backs and say, well, you're just reheating old leftovers that have been discredited here. So again, it's always a contradiction in terms.
Yeah, and if I could just jump in here with one more example of how this vagueness can be a problem. You mentioned all that money for Golden Dome. I just read recently that they're now talking about moving Sentinel funding under Golden Dome, which Sentinel is the new ICBM replacement. And that basically means that some of this vague funding in OBA could be used to help pay for this wildly over budget. I believe it's 81% over budget, nuclear ICBM. So that was not the intent necessarily of lawmakers when they included money for Golden Dome, and yet that may well be how it's spent. It's, effectively a slush fund.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, thanks for that point. And let's start to open it up a little bit here, and because I think this is a good way to get more of a roundtable. So Julia, since Pete has given you a plug for your work, what are your thoughts about the reconciliation process?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think that bipartisan national security making and the budgeting process in particular is essential. And, Pete pointed out that bills that, progressives championed, the IRA, for example, the ACA, they're examples of Democrats and Republicans using the reconciliation process to basically avoid deliberation. And I will put Pete on the spot. And, again, this is the subject of another webinar, but the central core issue here is, in fact, the filibuster and filibuster reform. And so that is really, I think, like an area that, perhaps there could be action taken. But on the reconciliation process itself, I mean, it is not a way to do major policymaking. And I'm very concerned about the prospects of setting the national security top line through the reconciliation process in the future.
Yeah, and hawks are also opposed, a lot of them, to the reconciliation process. I wonder if I could get your take on this, Pete, because Mitch McConnell, for example, the chairman of the Senate Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, doesn't like reconciliation because he doesn't think it's supportive enough of defense. In that it's a one-time infusion of cash, for programs that won't. Then when reconciliation goes away, you have to fit all those programs into a smaller into the frame of a smaller budget. Reminds me of when we had the war supplementals for Iraq and Afghanistan. They were offloading a lot of base budget programs onto them, and then when the supplementals went away, they were like, "Oh crap! How are we going to fit all this under our fixed top line?"
Yeah, but they ended up doing it anyway.
They managed. Yes,
that's kind of the problem. I mean, Senator McConnell has a point, but Congress always finds a way to spend more money. Once the programs are created, they take on the life of their own. And again, just so I can get more hate mail, we're witnessing this debate right now with the COVID plus up of Affordable Care Act subsidies that were supposed to expire at the end of this year, but now are sacrosanct and somehow have to be funded, according to many in Congress. Same thing happens on the military side.
I will say that, defense is unique in the sense that, the debt deal, for example, the loophole was for like emergency spending. And, a lot of that emergency spending was, in fact, for the military. And so it is true. There were a lot of members of Congress that were up in arms this year about a flat, top line on the military, not taking into account those reconciliation funds. But I think it's kind of a insincere way to look at the way national security budgeting if you're only looking at NDA.
Yeah, and getting to the point, since we don't have much time left, of things we can champion to change that. There's a bill, H.R. 3912, called Stop Baseline Bloat Act, part of our 30 recommendations we made to Congress for budgetary reforms that would prevent emergency and supplemental from being built back into the baseline so that, the hawks can claim, well, because this funding it has been appropriated before, we have to assume it continues forever. It shouldn't. If it's truly emergency and supplemental, it should go away, and they shouldn't be rending garments over it all the time.
Well, we don't know yet whether there will be another reconciliation bill in 2026. The OMB director said this past weekend that is still to be decided. But, I think back about how the reconciliation process really introduced chaos into the writing of the defense spending bills this year. The House Appropriations Committee wrote its defense spending bill while reconciliation was still in process and before the fiscal 26 budget had even, in all of its detail, had been submitted to Congress. And so they were really at a disadvantage. In fact, the Trump administration pitched its $1 trillion budget, defense budget, but in reality, more than $100 billion of that was from reconciliation. So it wasn't really a $1 trillion budget. Or at least the base budget was not. And they made a lot of colossal errors in the base budget. Said reconciliation is providing X billion dollars for amphibious ships and Y billion dollars for submarines, but it wasn't in any reconciliation proposal at that point. So then appropriators had to make sense of this. So it also add some confusion if it's done in that way, especially, right?
Yeah, and I'll just also add that it makes it harder to track these congressional program increases. I mean, not all of the funding in reconciliation was actually requested by the administration, but it's really hard to say when you don't know what fiscal year or even what service or account some of this funding is going to be under. I mean, the funding tables were very vague. They requested spending plans from the Pentagon, but those spending plans were then classified without any explanation, which is really unusual. So I think, the whole process is not friendly to oversight, and that's a big problem.
While we've got you, Gabe, do you have any thoughts about whether there's a connection between any efforts to deal with the program increases issue and acquisition reform?
I'm not sure about efforts to deal with them. I will say I think acquisition reform has implications for program increases. I mean, Julia talked about some of the things like raising thresholds for requirements for contractors to provide the Pentagon with certified cost and pricing data. That may mean that many of these already questionable increases will be basically marked up to whatever price the industry thinks it can get away with. So I think, that's a problem. And, again, a lot of these increases are under $50 million. Some of those are going to fall below those thresholds. So I think that's kind of the main connection that I see. I'd be curious if Julia has thoughts.
No, I don't have too much to add. I mean, I think like a lot of the incentives are the same, and we definitely need it to be politically expedient for Congress members to make decisions at the end of the day.
Okay, a question or two from the audience, and this is maybe we can focus a little bit more on sort of, having described so many problems, ideas for a few solutions have come forth in our discussion here. But this one questioner says, how can we structurally decrease the power of Pentagon contractors who are using all these mechanisms to enrich themselves with the help of members of Congress and the administration? Any thoughts on that question?
I guess just quickly, I mean, I think that we need a cut and build plan. Cut the Sentinel, cut XYZ earmarks from the Pentagon budget, cut, wish list, which we didn't talk about, cut all of these examples of drivers of Pentagon spending that all of us have exposed for years now. And in the same bill, create politically expedient ways to, generate jobs that isn't military spending. The purpose of military spending is not to create jobs. Now, you could make an argument that there are other types of government spending that their explicit purpose is to provide, a service to Americans and to stimulate the economy in the process. I don't see how members will ever get on board with cuts to programs that the military might not need and that are performing terribly in terms of cost and like on the battlefield. I don't see them being able to like make that kind of trade-off, even if it cost 2 jobs in their district. We need a parallel effort in order to address that issue in one fell swoop.
Gabe or Pete, any thoughts on to close us out or in terms of solutions?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, when it comes to program increases, and I think this applies in some ways to the others as well, some of it's just we need to have a real debate about this stuff. There's nothing wrong with lawmakers looking after their constituents. That's part of their job, but it needs to happen in a holistic way that doesn't make national security subservient to those interests. And, furthermore, military spending is shown to be a relatively bad jobs creator. It creates fewer jobs per dollar invested than many other sectors. So if that's really the goal, there are better ways. And I think, implementing some transparency around this will, help ensure that lawmakers aren't just boosting the Pentagon budget to reward their campaign contributors. I think Congress shouldn't just assume that every lawmaker with an idea for an increase has done their homework. And so having folks identify themselves, list a strategic justification, explain what's going to be offset and why it's worth it, I think that would go a long way.
One very quick and practical suggestion on our annual no-brainers list for bipartisan legislation, the Transparency in Contract Pricing Act, Senators Warren, Grassley, Ernst, and Slotkin, that would create some early warning systems in a lot of these contracts that don't have competitive bidding. But ultimately, and here again, send the hate mail my way, there are so many federal programs, civilian and military, that fail year after year. And the simple thing to remember for members of Congress to do here is stop rewarding failure, whether it's Amtrak, Head Start, Sentinel, F-35, Ford-class aircraft carrier. These programs are failures, and giving them more money is only a guarantee that they will keep failing.
Well, thank you all very much for your input. Unless there are any last words, I think we've been at it for just a little over an hour. It's been a very stimulating conversation, and I appreciate Taxpayers for Common Sense organizing it and inviting me to moderate. It's been really productive. And so I want to turn it over to Steve to close this out.
Thanks, John. And thanks to Gabe, Julia, and Pete for being here. We really appreciate it and found the conversation very enlightening. And please come back to our website at www.taxpayer.net. We will have the tape of this up soon, and you can take a look at it and peruse it and digest it even further. Thank you again for coming and enjoying our webinar. Thank you.